Welcome back, everyone. It's Charlie. This will be my full Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power Episode 8 finale video. There's a whole bunch of Easter eggs and references. We finally got some of our really big answers. Like, we finally found out who Sauron really is. We found out what's going on with Meteor Man, so we'll break it all down. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the videos. I will do videos for Season 2 when it gets here. They're in the middle of making it right now, but the way they talk about it, they won't be ready to release it till like 2024, so it's going to be a while before it comes out. Careful for spoilers for the episode. If you haven't seen it yet, we'll just start at the beginning and work our way through shot by shot, talking about Easter eggs, WTF moments as we go along. The episode was titled Alloyed, which is a reference to them using the Mithril with the new Super Forge and binding different metals together, like the metals from Galadriel's dagger, the gold and the silver from Valinor, because the minerals from Valinor were way more pure than the ones from Middle-earth, making the Elven Rings of Power much more powerful than the other Rings of Power. Some of this is canon from the books, and some of this is them adding some stuff to the canon. Like, I don't think there's any references to them using Galadriel's brother's dagger to create the Elven Rings of Power. Like, there's no real details on that. So that's just something that they added to the show. And the whole idea with Galadriel's character is that much later in the timeline, like during the events of the Peter Jackson movies in the Third Age, she's way less warlike, and she spends most of her time with her husband trying to protect their city. So I think the idea with her getting rid of the dagger by sacrificing, like they say, true creation requires sacrifice, sacrificing her dagger is basically like her saying that she's going to become less warlike in the future. Like she's laying down arms, pursuing a less dark path, because that was the path that was driving her closer to Sauron. But the actual opening scene is a Meteor Man and the Harfoots continuing their journey to Mordor through the Greenwood. That's called Erin Galen, like they have the title up on screen here. The Greenwood is basically what will eventually turn into Mirkwood later in the timeline during the events of the Hobbit movies. Sauron's power basically turned it evil, like he darkened the area, the same way that Morgoth did with his power. Sauron during the episode even makes a lot of references to his untold backstory with Morgoth, like in a way that you don't hear about in the books. But the whole idea here with the women is that we find out these female mages are from Rhûn. They are followers of Morgoth and Sauron. Technically, they're followers of Morgoth, and Sauron is sort of like the next best person who's available to them. And they're just resolving the whole storyline with him trying to decide who he is, not being totally sure. And they explain later in the episode, too, that when he landed on Middle-earth, he didn't have all of his memories. Like, they slowly came back to him, as did his true power. Which is also meant to be a parallel for what happened with Sauron. But the whole idea is the women confuse the signs and believe that he is Sauron, when really he is a Maiar, just like Sauron is. Like, they're both from the same group of angels, basically. Only Meteor Man winds up being one of the Blue Wizards. Now, he specifically calls out the Istar, the Istari. That's the group that Gandalf comes from, that Saruman, the other wizards, come from. But there are a couple other references that they make specifically during their conversations when they're talking about Rhûn that I think refers to the Blue Wizards, which I think this guy is going to wind up being, because the books don't really go into great detail about the Blue Wizards, whereas the wizards that we mostly know of, like Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, all those people don't show up till the Third Age. Obviously, the other side of this is the reveal that Halbrand has really been Sauron this whole time. Don't worry, I will talk all about that, because it basically confirms all of our theories from the first couple of episodes. Like, I was actually surprised, like, wait a minute, you mean we were right originally? Because there were so many misdirects about who Halbrand was, we were all kind of wondering how much trickery they were trying to pull with us. Like, is the show just trying to mislead us and give us false clues about who he really is? What they revealed is that the game that they were playing was much simpler, like they weren't trying to trick us as much as we thought they were. So when you go back and you rewatch the series now, knowing who everybody really is, it'll recontextualize all of Halbrand's scenes, like it'll make way more sense. Then we see Galadriel riding with the wounded Halbrand to Celebrimbor's city, Eregion, and the whole idea is that his power has been diminished so much that it is possible to wound him in this way. Don't worry, I'll explain how the Maiar's powers work and how you can actually destroy their physical body, but you can't really kill their soul. Like, what happens to Sauron after they destroy the One Ring of Power? It might seem like he's permanent at that time, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. But all these early scenes with the elves are meant to set up them creating the Rings of Power. Like, they haven't quite got the idea yet, and the whole idea is that Halbrand tries to trick them, Anatar style, Lord of Gifts. He kind of coaches Celebrimbor into thinking that the idea was his the whole time. Like, early on, Halbrand shows up at Celebrimbor's forge pretending like he was looking for Galadriel, but really this is him just manipulating Celebrimbor with flattery, orchestrating things so that Celebrimbor thinks that this was all his idea the whole time, even though Galadriel eventually finds out what's up with him. When he references the master smith he apprenticed to, speaking of Celebrimbor's works, he's talking about the Valar Aule, the same one who created the dwarves. Sauron's whole specialty was in crafting things. That's how he came up with the idea for the Rings of Power, because he learned it from Aule, who is also referred to as the Smith. we see the 3 gemstones that they used to create the 3 elven rings of power. Now these are just like regular gemstones. The red one is called Narnia, that's the red ring of fire. Eventually it's worn by Gandalf later in the timeline during the events of the Lord of the Rings movies, and he takes it with him on the boat back to Valinor. The first wearer winds up being Gil-galad, like they give it to him first, then it goes to Círdan the shipwright, who's going to be a character during season 2, and then it passes to Gandalf. Nenya is the white one here. It's the Ring of Water. It's Galadriel's ring. She also wears it all the way to the end of Return of the King and takes it back to Valinor with them. And the blue one is Vilya, the blue ring of air. Eventually Elrond winds up becoming its bearer, and he also takes it with them back to Valinor. So like all the elven rings of power will eventually go back to Valinor at the end of Return of the King. The whole idea here is that they were never touched by Sauron's hands though, so they're not bound to the One Ring of Power, which is why when Sauron creates the One Ring of Power, like they tease at the end of the episode, like he's staring at Mount Doom, like, gonna create some more rings, it doesn't hurt Galadriel or the other bearers of the elven rings. But once they do destroy the One Ring, it does diminish the power of the elven rings of power. One of the other power upgrades that they give to the elven rings that are different from the other rings of power that they give to the humans and the dwarves is the actual mithril and the ore from Valinor. Like the whole idea is that it's going to be more powerful than the ore Sauron will use to create the other rings of power. It's the gold and silver from Galadriel's brother's dagger, but also the mithril, which contains the light of a Silmaril, which is basically the light from the 2 trees in the lamps. So they want to show you fundamentally that the elven rings are very different from the other rings of power. One of their abilities, like a lot of the other rings, is to basically prolong life, to preserve things. They do have some other powers, so Narnia also has the power to inspire others to stand strong against evil and tyranny, to resist domination and despair, in other words, to give hope where it was needed. You hear Gandalf giving a lot of speeches to the Fellowship later in the timeline about this. Galadriel's ring Nenya gave her the power to protect and preserve things. Later in the timeline, when she founds the city of Lothlorien, there's a lot of references to her using the power of the ring to hide it from Sauron. There aren't a lot of references to the other powers of Vilya, the Ring of Air, but a lot of people believe that it's used to heal people. For the most part, the power of the other rings of power, like the lesser rings that are given to men, given to dwarves, even the One Ring of Power, are basically to preserve and prolong life because they contain a fraction of Sauron's power. Like he pours his power into the One Ring, it's kind of like a Horcrux for him. So the extra power upgrade that it gives to people that wear those lesser rings is basically them just wielding a portion of Sauron's power. And that's also what creates the connection between those rings in the One Ring of Power and Sauron's life force, which allows him to dominate the will of anyone who wears the rings. But when we're still with Meteor Man, the women talk about taking him to Rhûn, the far land east of Mordor. They teased that earlier this season. We didn't really explore that during the Peter Jackson movies. Like you see some of the people from Rhûn here, but that's about it. They eventually align with Mordor. When they call the constellation that he's been looking at this whole time the Hermit's Hat, that's another reference to the writers basically saying that he's one of the wizards, like a hermit's hat as in a wizard's hat. The reason why I think he's one of the blue wizards is just because in the canon, one of the blue wizards went to Rhûn, and we just haven't explored that in the books that much or in any of the movies, which is why I think that they thought that it was plumb to include in the series. Like, oh, we haven't done that before? Let's just put it in here. The Harfoots try to rescue him, and then he winds up trying to rescue them, remembering a little bit about who he is. He doesn't remember everything, but like he remembers how to speak well, like he can actually speak regular sentences. And he remembers how to use some of his power, like he takes their staff and sends them back to the unseen realm. That's basically what's happening here. That's why for a brief second, they look kind of like the Nazgul, like their spirits here are basically being blown back into the unseen realm. The whole thing with the butterflies, I think is meant to be a callback to the fireworks Gandalf used during the Lord of the Rings movies, looking kind of like butterflies. Also, in the canon, there's a constellation created by one of the Valar that's given the same name that the elves use for butterflies, so it could be just another reference to him being a Maiar, sent from Iluvatar, the same group of beings. But the idea is that even though he's from the Istar, they're like another subgroup of the Maiar, he is basically like the same type of being that Sauron is. Like they're like the same kind of power level. Also, all the references that the women make to him slowly regaining his strength and remembering his power is another parallel for Sauron. It explains why he's so weak during the events of Episode 1, and he references that later when he's trying to convince Galadriel to allow him to create the Rings of Power and take over the planet, like, join me at my side. I'll talk about that in a second when we get to that part of the episode, because a lot of their conversation is literally the same conversation that Galadriel has with Frodo later when he tries to give her the One Ring of Power. Sadok winds up being one of the big casualties of the finale, so R.I.P. When we go to Elendil and Miriel talking about the faithful, those are just the group of people who believe in the Valar still and wind up coming back to Middle-earth to fight Sauron. They're also the ones that survive the downfall of Numenor and wind up creating Gondor. Even though there's still lots of questions about what happened to Isildur, obviously he's very critical, he's not dead, like they're not going to kill him off because he's so important later in the timeline. He's basically like Aragorn's great-great-great-great-grandfather many times removed. He'll probably wind up showing up during Season 2, Episode 1. It also seems like they're teasing a relationship between Elendil and Miriel here. The thing that shocks him when they get back to Numenor are the black flags in the harbor marking the death of her father. When Sauron suggests combining the Mithril with the other ores to stretch it out, that's a reference to the title of the episode, creating an alloy combining two metals. Also, the term stretching out is a reference to the side effects of the Rings of Power, stretching out lifespans. Like Bilbo says later in the timeline, butter spread out on too much toast. It doesn't give you more years on your lifespan, it just stretches out your lifespan, because originally Sauron was planning for all the Rings of Power to be worn by elves who are already immortal, so it's not really an issue for them. But for humans who only live for like 100 years, it basically just makes them live for thousands of years theoretically, which is why Gollum deteriorates the way that he does, because his body just wasn't meant to survive that long. When he says precious metals were scarce in the place he came up in, he's talking about the place before creation, like the void of nothingness. And when he says his idea to Celebrimbor is a gift, that's a reference to his Anatar name from the books, which literally means Lord of Gifts. Back on Numenor, Pharazôn talks about the impending death of the former king, Miriel's father. It seems like he's putting his plans into motion, just leading up to the downfall. They tease this a lot through Isildur's sister as well, when she finds the Palantir. But I think the whole idea here is that that's such a big thing, they're probably going to save it for like Season 3, like maybe like a cliffhanger ending for Season 3, WTF moment. His sister is chosen as one of the draftsmen to design his monument after he dies. When he grabs her and whispers about knowing what she's done in the dark of night, he's talking about what Sauron was doing when he was using the Palantir himself, because he also says he gets confused because he stared into it for too long, so he confuses the past, the present, and the future. So the entire timeline to him is just this jumble of images without any context. But he continues talking to her, thinking that she's Miriel, talking about the doom of Numenor. That's what he means when he says they have to restore the old ways or the island will fall. Like, literally, it will fall into the ocean. It's called the downfall for a couple reasons, but like it's a metaphor and a literal thing. And even though they don't show us what she sees in the Palantir, I think the idea is that she's supposed to see the same thing that Galadriel and that Miriel saw, which is the doom itself. And at the beginning of Season 2, she'll wind up telling her father about that, like, I saw something crazy in the Palantir. Then when we go back to Gil-galad, he talks about having one object for all of Middle-earth. That's him talking about the One Ring of Power, one ring to rule them all. But like I said, they want to tease this out through the episode, like they go through a couple different iterations of their idea, like, should it be a crown, one crown, no, two things? What about three things? He says the Blight accelerated after the eruption of Mount Doom, and when Celebrimbor says that Halbrand or Sauron's suggestions were the key that unlocked the dam, that's really what makes things click in Galadriel's mind. Like right after that, he says not of flesh, but over flesh, and mentions the unseen world, and those are all things that are said during the Lord of the Rings movies about the One Ring of Power. And the whole idea with Galadriel, at least canonically in the books, is that she was never fooled by Sauron. She knew exactly what was up with him the whole time. And that's basically what happens during this episode. Like, immediately once he starts pushing for the creation of the Rings of Power, she realizes exactly what's happening. Like bursting of a dam, didn't I just see a giant dam burst and then set off Mount Doom in this giant eruption? Oh, something's up here. The unseen world mention is also a callback to her seeing Sauron's forge in episode 1 in their fortress. When Gil-galad references Elrond not being owed anything, that's just a reference to what happened with his deception in the dwarves, the Mithril. His comment about hope is a reference to his speech that he'll eventually have with the hobbits during the Lord of the Rings movies later in the timeline, like meager, small, hobbits, small. Loved all the montage scenes of them actually in Celebrimbor's forge creating the Rings of Power. Like you see Halbrand kind of like pushing him, talking in the background, just kind of subtly influencing him. Like, what if we tried these things? The whole idea here is that he had to make Celebrimbor feel like all this stuff was his idea, otherwise it wouldn't have worked. Here's the whole thing with the genealogy chart and the line of kings in the Southlands. Initially, Galadriel just wants to prove that Halbrand isn't who he says he is, he's really Sauron. But when Elrond finds it at the end of the episode and starts freaking out, I think they'll reveal that Theo is actually the true heir of the last king of the Southlands. Like, there is an heir, but it's Theo because he has this mystery father that they still haven't paid off yet. And it just seems like a really big arc for his character. Like, they were teasing him potentially becoming evil, but I think they want to tease redemption for him eventually. Like, you are the line of kings, you have a chance to save these people. Also, the funny thing with the king references is you remember the old man. Like, the old man was right the whole time. He kept talking about their true king returning, but he said that that was Sauron, and that's basically the way things played out in the show. Like, yes, I am your true king, as he's talking to the other Southlanders. He is the king of men, he is the king of this area, but not the one you thought you were getting. His whole speech with Galadriel about not believing someone like him would ever be in this elven city is just another callback to the War of Wrath and what happened with the wars before that. Before the War of Wrath, like that was like the last big war with Morgoth, the one where the Valar eventually got involved. so the elves would slaughter him on sight if they knew that it was him. Which is why he's so amazed that he's walking around like, wow, it's so amazing that I could just walk around in broad daylight and nobody kills me. He makes all these references to Galadriel being the one to save him, giving up hope until she helped him find it again. Obviously, he has a much darker connotation now, and I think that he's being true. Like, I think that he, Sauron, had kind of given up on his grand plan until he happened upon Galadriel and just used the opportunity. And now Galadriel will just carry the guilt of that going forward into the Third Age for thousands of years. I was the one who convinced Sauron that he could carry on with his plan to conquer the world. There's this real special connection that they're forging between the two of them on the show that we don't really see in the Lord of the Rings movies. But the whole idea here is that he's still at a fraction of his power. Like, you see him use some of his power when he enters Galadriel's mind and messes with some of her memories and her brother, and physically he's able to stop her because elves are way stronger than normal humans. Basically what happened, according to the show, like the reason why he's so weak now, why he lost hope, so to speak, is because Adar says that he killed him, but because the Maiar are immortal beings, you can't actually destroy their spirits. Eventually their spirits will coalesce and they'll be able to form a new body again, which he did in the Halbrand body. But like the wizard, when he first lands on Middle-earth, like he first enters this physical form, they're in a very weakened state and it takes them time to amass their full power again. That's what happened with Sauron after Adar killed him. Like, eventually he formed another body, which is the Halbrand body that we see walking around here. He lost some of his memories and most of his power, but over time it just slowly all came back to him. Like, by the events of this episode, he remembers everything about his past, and he's got some of his power, probably still has a little ways to go before he's at full power again. This also happens later in the timeline during the downfall of Numenor. Like, he's on Numenor during the downfall, and his body is destroyed, so he resurrects again because he's a Maiar, he's immortal. But he resurrects at a fraction of his power, and he can't change form anymore. Like, he's severely weakened, which is why you always see him walking around in the giant armor during later the timeline in the Third Age. Something similar to this happened to Morgoth, but in a slightly different way. The whole idea is that the Valar and the Maiar have a finite level of power. Now, it's crazy power. The Valar are more powerful than the Maiar. If you thought that Sauron was like this crazy, powerful, evil person, Morgoth is like 10 times more powerful than he is. But during the show, when they keep referencing the blight that's affecting Lindon that will eventually fall over the entire planet, like this shadow of darkness that's falling over the planet, the Sauron tells Galadriel that he's going to stop. Like, I will save the world, and it will redeem me in the eyes of Iluvatar. It's all a reference to Morgoth literally pouring his dark power into the planet to darken, to change it. What ended up happening during the first stage before he was defeated is that he poured too much of his power into the planet, and it weakened him so much that he was basically trapped on Middle-earth. You'd have to imagine like an angel being weakened to the point where it couldn't leave its physical form anymore. That's what happened to Morgoth, and eventually what happens to Sauron. When he admits to finding the crest on a dead man, he's talking about the last king from 1,000 years ago from the Southlands during the War of Wrath. Like, he's saying that he found it on the last king because he killed the last king. I killed him, then I took it from his body. He also reminds us that Adar is his enemy, like I fought beside you against our enemy, yours and mine, a reference to him sticking it to Adar, getting revenge for Adar killing him thousands of years ago. And when he says he's been awake since before the breaking of the first silence, he's talking about the time before creation itself. So at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings timeline, Iluvatar creates the Valar, the Maiar, and they sing creation into existence, and that includes the planet. They refer to that song of creation as the Great Song, so like that's them breaking the silence. So it's like him saying, I've been alive since before creation itself. And when he says he's had many names in the time he's been alive, Sauron is just the more recent name that he was given by the elves later in the timeline. In their language, it just means the abhorred. His original name that the other Maiar called him was Mairon, which just means admirable and excellent. Because remember, he's kind of like a fallen angel like Morgoth. So originally, he looked like this. He was a very angelic being. But he fell from grace, turned to evil. The Númenóreans also give him the name Ziggur, which means sorcerer. He also calls himself Annatar, like I said previously when he references the gifts, because Annatar means Lord of Gifts. He was also called Artano, which means High Smith, because his whole skill is in making things. And the other big name he was called by was Aulendil, which means friend of Aule, the smith, the person that he studied under. Then using his power, which he's amassed enough of, he's able to enter her mind and manipulate her memories, taking her to this memory from the prologue in episode 1 of her childhood, talking to her brother. But it's him manipulating all these scenes, so he's the one that's speaking even though you're hearing her brother's voice. And all these scenes are him trying to win her to his cause. When he references feeling the light of the One again, he's talking about Iluvatar, because Morgoth darkened all of his followers, including Sauron, literally and metaphorically, like twisted them to evil. So Iluvatar's light is metaphorical and literal. It's also a callback to the light of the lamps, and then to the two trees, and the same light coming from the Mithril. And all of these scenes are them basically trying to create a more complex characterization for Sauron. And it's like a Walter White Breaking Bad kind of version of Sauron, where he believes that he's doing something good, but he winds up doing terrible things in the process, and it's a slippery slope, and he slowly does worse and worse things until he's full-blown evil. The showrunners during season 2 even said they're doing like a Walter White version of Sauron. And I think the reference is more to late-era Walter White, like not Walter White at the beginning of the Breaking Bad story, but like Walter White later in the story, right before he gets to the point where he says, "I am the danger." And the way he tries to sell her on this is that he's doing all this to help bring peace to the world, but the idea is that it's his peace through his force. Like he'll rule the world and bring it peace, or it'll bring it death. The iron fist of peace. And I think the idea is that he's meant to believe that in doing that and healing the world with his forced peace, like whatever he calls peace, he thinks that'll win him forgiveness from Iluvatar. Obviously, probably not going to happen, because like even later in the timeline, after they kill him, because you can't kill Sauron in a traditional sense because he's a Maiar, once the One Ring of Power is destroyed, his spirit basically dissipates to a level where it's so near zero, he'll never be able to bring his form together and reform another physical body. So essentially, he's no longer a threat, but he's still technically not dead. When he shows the vision of them standing side by side and he starts talking to her about becoming his queen, this speech is basically exactly what she says to Frodo later. And now with the added context, it's like she's actually remembering that when Frodo offers her the One Ring of Power. When Elrond rescues Galadriel from the river, she calls him Deceiver. That's what she called Sauron later, Sauron the Deceiver.
But they were all of them deceived.
When he says the first time they met was when he was first orphaned, that was in Beleriand here before it was sank in the War of Wrath, and he was being raised by the enemy, so to speak, like one of the sons of Feanor, which basically killed his father and then led to the death of his mother. Then Sauron takes off. We see him at the end of the episode showing up in front of Mordor, Mount Doom, getting ready to create the rest of the Rings of Power and the One Ring of Power. I think the whole idea is that he'll create the other lesser rings first and offer them to the dwarves and to the humans, and then he'll create the One Ring of Power. Like that'll be the end of Season 2, Season 3. We'll see how fast they blow through the timeline. Like how many rings are going to be flying around by the end of Season 2? And all the references that Galadriel makes to Celebrimbor about the power being for them alone, like we need to create a power that's separate just for the elves, that's a reference to the relationship of these Rings of Power to the other Rings of Power. Like I said, because they weren't touched by Sauron, they were also protected from Sauron's influence when he created the One Ring. They also melt down her brother's dagger. Like I said, I think that's also metaphorically meant to be her slowly adopting a more peaceful stance. When we go back to the wizard, he literally uses the name Istar as in Istari. They're a subgroup of Maiar, but they're all still Maiar, so he's just like Sauron is. Nori going with him and them heading to Rhûn is their way of basically telling you that most of Season 2's Harfoot story will just be through her character, but they might bring some of the other Harfoots back eventually. When he references the path laid out for them by greater powers, it's a reference to Iluvatar sending him to Middle-earth in this physical form with the task of helping them stop Sauron. Iluvatar also did the exact same thing later in the timeline with Gandalf and the other Istari like Saruman and Radagast. And during Two Towers, when Gandalf was resurrected as Gandalf the White, essentially what happened, because you can't kill Maiar, his spirit just went back to where it came from, and Iluvatar kind of turned it around on its way and sent him back to Middle-earth. You have to imagine Gandalf's cosmic soul screaming through outer space to the place where Iluvatar lives, and Iluvatar reaching out with a giant finger and just turning his path around so that he screams back to Middle-earth. Typically, Iluvatar wouldn't do stuff like that for just anybody. The reason why he did it for Gandalf is because his task that he had given him wasn't complete yet. They hadn't destroyed the One Ring of Power yet. When he starts talking about adventures and journeys, it's another callback to the actual Fellowship of the Ring. And when we go back to Celebrimbor's forge, they finish crafting the Elven Rings of Power. When Elrond drops the Mithril piece into the melting ore pot here, it's made to look like the Eye of Sauron again, just like the meteor impact site is meant to look like the Eye of Sauron. So just lots of references to the Eye of Sauron throughout the series. We'll probably see even more of that during Season 2. I already explained which of these rings are, who they go to, what their special powers are earlier in the video. And I also already explained what's going on with Elrond in this tag scene at the end where he grabs the document about the genealogy of the line of kings in the Southlands. Like I said, I think this is going to be about Theo being the true heir to the last king. And we end the episode with Sauron looking at Mount Doom, preparing to create the other Rings of Power and the One Ring of Power, with them then singing the song from the books about the creation of all the rings, which is actually a pretty cool song. I love the way they use that over the credits. The showrunner said that during Season 2, Sauron will be walking around in his fair form. Now, but they said that last week. I think what they meant is that he'll be walking around looking like Halbrand this whole time, but eventually, at some point during the series, he'll put his armor back on. But for the most part, you'll see him walking around without the armor on. Like they want you to see his face. Also, because Adar is still alive, I think they'll have a big battle between Sauron and Adar, like another rematch, where Sauron will wind up killing him. and that'll just be his way of taking control of Mordor. If there's any other Easter eggs and references in the episode that I didn't talk about in the video, just write them below in the comments. And also let me know, which wizard do you think that Meteor Man is? Is he one of the blue wizards, or is he going to be some other character from the canon? My full House of the Dragon episode 9 video will post on Sunday. Be sure to enable alerts for my channel so you don't miss that. Everyone click here for my House of the Dragon episode 9 video, and everyone click here for my House of the Dragon episode 8 video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.